stand in the chapel of Henry VII at Westminster Abbey today, and the silence feels heavy with ghosts. More than 4 million tourists walk past the Tudor tombs each year, snapping photographs of marble effigies that reveal nothing of the terror, loneliness, and constant physical pain that defined 5 royal lives. But rewind 5 centuries, and you would have found yourself in bedchambers where monarchs woke to the smell of their own festering wounds, in council rooms where every signature could trigger a rebellion, in private chapels where prayers for an heir became desperate bargains with God. Paranoia. Succession. Agony. Death. Using cutting-edge AI reconstruction and primary source evidence from royal physicians, ambassadors, and the monarch's own letters, we are about to walk you through the daily reality of every Tudor sovereign, from Henry VII's sleepless nights counting coins to Elizabeth's final days refusing to name her successor. Henry VII woke every morning at 5 to the sound of his groom of the stool drawing back crimson curtains in rooms kept deliberately cold. He believed fresh air prevented plague. The first Tudor king dressed himself in layers, a linen shirt, woolen hose tied with points, a doublet, and finally the heavy ermine-trimmed gown that marked his rank. His Venetian ambassador noted in 1497 that Henry wore the same grave expression whether receiving news of a son's birth or a pretender's landing. He broke his fast alone on manchet bread and weak ale, scanning account books his clerks had prepared overnight. Every penny mattered. Henry personally audited the royal household expenses, initialing each page in his cramped hand. His son Henry VIII, by contrast, woke to music. As a young king in 1509, Henry VIII rose at 7 to the sound of lutes and viols played by his chamber musicians. He required an audience for dressing. 16 gentlemen attended him, each responsible for one garment. The ritual took 40 minutes. Foreign ambassadors marveled at his energy. Before Mass he would practice archery in the tiltyard, his frame already running to bulk despite his 23 years. Edward VI, crowned at 9 in 1547, had no choice in his rising. His uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, controlled his schedule to the minute. The boy king woke at 6, studied Latin until 8, heard morning prayer, then returned to his schoolroom for Greek, French, and theology. His tutor John Chake recorded that Edward once translated 21 chapters of Cicero before dinner. The child wore black constantly. Protestant sobriety demanded it. Mary I rose before dawn throughout her reign from 1553 to 1558, driven to her private chapel for the first of 5 daily masses. Spanish ambassador Simon Renaud reported that she spent 3 hours on her knees each morning, praying for a child she would never conceive. Her ladies found her weeping in her oratory more than once. Elizabeth I, in her later years, refused to rise before 10. She had learned that a queen who kept her counselors waiting controlled the day. Every meal a Tudor monarch ate was a potential assassination. Henry VII employed 3 separate food tasters and required that all dishes be covered with cloth seals until they reached his table. He ate sparingly: roasted capon, boiled mutton, manchet bread, and pears stewed in wine. His household accounts from 1505 show he consumed an average of 1,200 calories daily, unusually modest for a king. He trusted no cook completely. When his wife Elizabeth of York died suddenly in 1503, rumors of poison circulated for months, though modern historians attribute her death to postpartum infection. Henry VIII ate like a man convinced each meal might be his last. By 1540, his daily intake exceeded 5,000 calories. Breakfast at 10 featured half a dozen meat courses: venison, swan, peacock, beef, and mutton, washed down with a gallon of ale. His yeoman of the mouth served him on plates of gold, and a soor, a specialized servant, tasted every dish twice. The king's groom of the stool kept meticulous records of his bowel movements, noting in 1546 that His Majesty suffered constant constipation, likely from a diet containing almost no vegetables. The ulcer on Henry's thigh, which oozed pus throughout his final decade, gave off such a stench that ambassadors stood 10 feet away during audiences. Edward VI Protestant Council enforced meatless Fridays and imposed a grain-based diet they considered morally improving. The boy king's surviving menu from 1551 lists barley broth, boiled cod, rye bread, and weak beer. He was forbidden sugar. Archbishop Cranmer declared it a popish luxury. Edward's physical frailty, which would kill him at 15 in 1553, was almost certainly worsened by chronic malnutrition. Modern analysis of his symptoms suggests tuberculosis, but his restricted diet gave his body no reserves to fight. Mary I returned the court to Catholic abundance. Her household fed 300 people twice daily on roasted meats, meat pies, custards, and Rhenish wine. But the Queen herself barely ate. Ambassador Renaud reported in 1554 that Mary's phantom pregnancies, she announced too, delivered none, coincided with periods where she consumed nothing but broth and communion wafers, convinced that suffering and fasting would make God grant her a child. Her physicians diagnosed hysteria. Elizabeth I turned dining into theatre. She ate in public once weekly, seated beneath a canopy of state while courtiers watched in silence. Her meals featured 30 dishes, though she rarely touched more than 3: spiced chicken, manchette bread with butter, and candied violets. German visitor Paul Hentzner recorded in 1598 that the 65-year-old Queen's teeth were black from a lifetime of sugar consumption, and she concealed her mouth when she smiled. She drank beer for breakfast and wine for supper, and she outlived them all. Tudor monarchs rarely walked their own streets. Henry VII travelled England in a closed litter, curtains drawn, surrounded by 200 mounted guards. He feared crowds. After the Cornish rebellion reached the outskirts of London in 1497, he refused to process through the city without arquebusiers marching 10 paces ahead. His accounts show payments to informers in every county. He built a surveillance state on parchment and coin, monitoring nobles through a network of spies who reported directly to his chamber. When he did appear publicly, at his daughter Margaret's wedding in 1503, onlookers noted he never smiled and touched no one. Henry VIII, by contrast, craved adoration. In his first decade he rode through London streets in cloth of gold, scattering coins to crowds, jousting in tournaments where he always won because no knight dared unhorse the king. He built Whitehall Palace with 1,200 rooms and a tiltyard visible from the Thames, spectacle as statecraft. But after his leg injury in 1536, when a horse crushed him in the lists and he lay unconscious for 2 hours, his mobility collapsed. By 1540 he required a mechanical chair to move between floors, hauled by 4 yeomen. His final procession, to the prorogation of Parliament in 1545, saw him carried in a litter, his ulcerated leg propped on cushions, the smell announcing his arrival before the heralds did. Ambassador Charles de Marillac wrote that the king's own courtiers stood upwind. Edward VI processed through London only twice, at his coronation in 1547 and for his official entry in 1549. Both times he was carried on a canopied litter, dressed in white and silver, looking, said one witness, like a wax saint in a reliquary. His uncle the Duke of Somerset controlled every route, every crowd, every cheer. When Somerset fell in 1549 and John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, seized the regency, Edward became invisible. The boy spent his final 2 years confined to Greenwich and Hampton Court, coughing blood into silk handkerchiefs, while his council issued proclamations in his name. He died without seeing London again. Mary I's streets were battlegrounds. Her procession into London in August 1553, after she seized the throne from Lady Jane Grey, drew crowds so thick she could barely move. They shouted "Queen Mary" and threw flowers at her guards. But 5 years later, when she processed to Parliament in 1558 to beg funds for her war against France, the same street stood silent. Her marriage to Philip of Spain, solemnized in 1554, had turned the city against her. Merchants shuttered their windows. No bells rang. She returned to Whitehall weeping, and her council noted she refused to leave the palace grounds for 6 weeks afterward. London had rejected her. Elizabeth I turned procession into propaganda. Her accession day tilts, her annual progresses through the countryside, her surprise visits to the Royal Exchange, all were calculated performances. She dressed in white, the Virgin Queen, and allowed select citizens to touch her hand. In 1588, after the Armada, she rode to Tilbury in armour, addressing her troops with the speech her councillors had drafted but which she delivered as though the words were burning from her heart. "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." She understood that monarchy was a show, and the streets were her stage. But in her final years she travelled less. Her last public procession, in 1602, saw her carried in a litter, her face painted white with ceruse, a lead-based cosmetic that was slowly poisoning her, her hand so thin the veins showed through like a map of roads leading nowhere. Henry VII heard Mass daily, funded the construction of his chapel at Westminster at a cost of £14,000, and left instructions in his will for 10,000 Masses to be said for his soul. But his piety was transactional. Polydore Virgil, his court historian, recorded that Henry believed God rewarded fiscal discipline and punished extravagance. When his wife died, Henry spent more on mourning cloth than on her tomb. When his son Arthur died in 1502, the king wept once, in private, then returned to his account books. His faith was a ledger, prayers offered, sins balanced, eternity negotiated like a trade treaty. Henry VIII shattered English Christianity and never stopped believing he was God's chosen instrument. He wrote a defense of the Seven Sacraments in 1521, earning the title Fide Defensor, Defender of the Faith, from Pope Leo X. 11 years later he declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, dissolved 700 monasteries, and burned monks who refused the oath. Yet he attended Mass until the day he died, insisted on transubstantiation, and genuinely believed each of his 6 marriages had divine sanction. When he executed Thomas More in 1535 for refusing the Act of Supremacy, Henry wept and claimed More had forced his hand. When he sent Anne Boleyn to the scaffold in 1536, he was hunting the day of her beheading. His faith contained no contradiction because he was the faith. Edward VI absorbed Protestantism like a child learning grammar. Archbishop Cranmer and his tutors fed him Reformed theology until the boy could argue justification by faith in flawless Latin. Edward kept a private journal where he recorded sermons, noted heresies, and copied out passages from Calvin. In 1553, dying of tuberculosis, he drafted a will excluding his Catholic half-sister Mary from the succession, a 15-year-old king attempting to dictate the religion of a nation from his deathbed. He failed. Mary I burned 283 Protestants in 5 years because she believed their souls could still be saved by the purifying fire and her kingdom could be returned to Rome. She woke before dawn for Mass, took communion daily, and consulted her confessor before signing every death warrant. When Bishop Latimer and Bishop Ridley were chained to the stake at Oxford in 1555, Mary was at Hampton Court, on her knees, praying that their ashes would water the seeds of reconversion. She died believing she had failed God, her husband Philip had abandoned her, and her phantom pregnancies were divine punishment. Her last words, reported by her Lady Jane Dormer, was, "When I am dead, you will find Calais lying upon my heart," but Calais was simply the last loss in a life of them. Elizabeth I bent faith to survival. Raised Protestant, imprisoned under Mary, crowned in 1559, she immediately passed the Act of Uniformity and re-established the English Church, but she despised theological debate. "I will not make windows into men's souls," she said, and meant it. Catholics could worship in private as long as they obeyed in public. She executed priests only when they turned treasonous. She attended chapel because the role required it, but her private beliefs remain opaque. When her counselors pressed her to marry and produce an heir, she invoked God's will. When they begged her to name a successor, she invoked God's mystery. In her final illness in 1603, she refused the last rites, waved away the Archbishop of Canterbury, and died in silence. She had spent 44 years performing faith. In the end, she kept it to herself. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York in 1486 to unite the houses of Lancaster and York, and their relationship was a political merger that produced 8 pregnancies and 4 surviving children. He never remarried after her death in 1503. Ambassador reports suggest he considered marrying again for alliance purposes. He negotiated with Joanna of Naples in 1505, but he could not bring himself to finalize the match. Modern historians debate whether he loved Elizabeth or simply mourned the loss of a proven breeder. His household accounts record payments for a black mourning gown he wore for the rest of his life. Henry VIII loved serially, obsessively, and always in the service of succession. Catherine of Aragon gave him one daughter and at least 5 miscarriages across 18 years. He loved her until she could not give him a son, then he annulled the marriage and declared their daughter Mary a bastard. Anne Boleyn gave him another daughter and a miscarried male fetus. He loved her until he convinced himself she had bewitched him, then he had her beheaded. Jane Seymour gave him Edward and died 12 days later of puerperal fever. He loved her in death more than he had in life and ordered himself buried beside her. Anne of Cleves looked nothing like her portrait. He divorced her after 6 months but gave her a generous settlement and called her his beloved sister. Catherine Howard was 19 when he married her at 49. He loved her like a man trying to revive his youth, and when her premarital affairs surfaced, he had her executed and took to his bed for a week. Catherine Parr outlived him by nursing him through his final putrid years, and when he died in 1547 she married her first love within 4 months. Edward VI was betrothed at 9 to Elizabeth of Valois but died before the marriage could proceed. He left no romantic writings, no love letters, no of affection beyond a single mention in his journal of a French ambassador's daughter who played the virginals well. Mary I fell in love exactly once. Philip of Spain was 27, she was 37, and the marriage treaty of 1554 required him to remain in England only until she produced an heir. She announced her first pregnancy within months. Ambassadors reported her belly swelling, her chambers prepared, midwives summoned. No child came. She announced a second pregnancy in 1557. Again, nothing. Philip left for the Netherlands and never returned. Mary wrote him letters begging him to visit, letters her counselors found unsent among her papers after her death, letters so desperate they were burned. Elizabeth I used marriage negotiations as foreign policy. She entertained proposals from Philip II of Spain, Archduke Charles of Austria, Eric XIV of Sweden, Francois Duke of Anjou, and at least a dozen others. She rejected them all. She may have loved Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. He was her childhood friend, her master of horse, the man who sat closest to her at banquets. Court gossip claimed they were lovers. When his wife Amy Robsart died in a suspicious fall in 1560, scandal made marriage impossible. Elizabeth kept Dudley close until his death in 1588, wore his last letter in a pouch around her neck, and wrote on it his last letter. She died unmarried, childless, the last of her line. The Tudor dynasty ended not with conquest but with an empty cradle. Henry VII suffered recurring malaria from his exile in Brittany and chronic anxiety that his physicians diagnosed as melancholia. Account books record payments for herbal drafts, bloodletting, and consultations with astrologers who cast horoscopes to determine the safest days for travel. In his final year, 1509, he developed a wasting illness, possibly tuberculosis, possibly cancer, that left him bedridden for months. He died at Richmond Palace, attended by his confessor and his groom of the stool, having outlived his wife and 3 of his 7 children. Henry VIII medical history reads like a catalogue of consequences. In 1513 he contracted malaria campaigning in France. In 1524 a lance splintered against his helmet in a tournament, and he suffered blinding headaches for weeks, likely a concussion. In 1536 a horse fell on him, crushing his leg and leaving an ulcer that never healed. His physicians treated it with poultices of crushed pearls, lead salve, and ground rubies. The wound turned gangrenous. By 1546 his leg required daily draining, and the stench was so foul his privy chamber was fumigated with rosewater twice a day. Modern diagnosis suggests osteomyelitis and possibly type 2 diabetes. He died at Whitehall in January 1547, his body so swollen with edema that his coffin was sealed with lead and soldered shut. It exploded during transport to Windsor, and his remains had to be shoveled back in. Edward VI began coughing blood in January 1553. His physicians diagnosed consumption, tuberculosis, and tried every remedy in the royal pharmacopoeia: extract of spearmint, arsenic paste, ground horn of unicorn, narwhal tusk, and a potion made from the lungs of 9 young red-haired virgins. Nothing worked. By June he could not stand. His skin turned grey. He died at Greenwich on July 6, 1553, at 15 years old, his body so wasted the coffin weighed almost nothing. Mary I's phantom pregnancies were textbook pseudocyesis, a psychosomatic condition triggered by desperate longing. In 1554 her belly swelled, her period stopped, she felt fetal movement. Court physicians confirmed the pregnancy. Midwives were summoned. The cradle was prepared. No child came. In 1557 it happened again. Modern historians suggest ovarian cysts or uterine cancer. She died in 1558, likely of influenza or uterine cancer, after weeks of fever and delirium. She was 42. Elizabeth I survived smallpox in 1562, which left her face pocked and her vanity shattered. She banned mirrors from her presence chambers and began wearing the thick white lead makeup that became her trademark. The ceruse paste, made of white lead and vinegar, poisoned her slowly over 40 years, causing hair loss, skin necrosis, and probable neurological damage. In her final months she refused to eat, refused to sleep lying down. She believed lying flat would kill her, and paced her chambers until she collapsed. She died at Richmond on March 24, 1603, having reigned 44 years. Her autopsy, forbidden by her own orders but rumored in Spanish dispatches, suggested she died of blood poisoning from her cosmetics. 5 monarchs. 3 died in their beds. 2 left no children. None died peacefully. Stand in the Tower of London today, and you can still see the initials and bulletin carved into the wall of her cell, the desperate graffiti of a queen who knew the morning would bring the executioner. Walk through Hampton Court, and the ghosts are everywhere: Henry VIII Great Hall, Edward VI sickroom, Elizabeth's privy gardens where she learned of the Armada's defeat. The 5 Tudors lived lives of impossible contradiction, absolute power and absolute paranoia, divine right and mortal terror, the performance of majesty and the reality of festering wounds, failed pregnancies, and lonely deaths. They broke the church, burned their subjects, and reshaped a nation, all while suffering the same fevers, the same heartbreaks, the same mortal limits as the poorest farmer. The dynasty began with a usurper who never stopped counting his money and ended with a queen who turned loneliness into legend. What life was really like as a Tudor monarch: unbearable and utterly human. A crown that refused